Hello, welcome to Tales from the Green Benches, an oral history of Parliament, a new podcast from the History of Parliament Trust. I'm Emma Peplow and I'm Head of Contemporary History at the Trust.
And I'm Alexander Locke, historian and curator, and we're presenting this podcast together.
So in this first series, we're going to mine our vast treasure trove of oral history interviews with former MPs to examine life at Westminster through the words and the memories of the MPs themselves.
By weaving together these incredible clips, you're going to learn about life at Westminster as you've never heard it before.
First question when I went for an interview, which clubs are you a member of?
So they sent through an officials from Edinburgh to Glasgow and they interviewed me and then decided I was an appropriate candidate.
I mean, when I wrote to a minister, I didn't just act as a postbox. I really tried to act as an advocate, for somebody's problem.
So this time we're going to discuss a crucial moment in an MP's career, how you get on the ballot paper, a task that's sometimes actually harder than facing the election itself. So in the UK system, it's the local party who chooses the candidate, and sometimes that's helped with the national party, but normally it's the local party who have the final say. And this means there's a whole process of electioneering that takes place just to be selected and to be the candidate. And then which seat you're selected for can change your entire career. So in terms of your lifestyle and how you act as an MP.
So I know we're not going to go into too much detail about the process behind selection, but Emma, we've got to do it. Can you tell us very quickly what you would need to do to get selected for a party as a candidate?
Yes, so it depends really on which party you're talking about, and a lot of this changes over time. So what I'm going to say now is really quite a brief overview. So the Conservative Party, for the period we're talking about, so we're sort of talking about getting selected from the 1950s into the early 2000s. So they had a national list of approved candidates that the central party would put together, and you'd have to go on interview processes and so on to get on this list. And then that list was sent out to the local constituency associations, and then the local associations would advertise for their own candidates to this list. And then they'd create a shortlist, and then they'd interview that shortlist, and then they would be the ones who choose their candidate, and they would choose who went on the ballot paper based on that long process. But this has changed quite a lot, especially recently after sort of David Cameron introduced his A-list and various things like that.
It sounds very complicated and obviously changing over time. But what about the other parties then?
So I think the Labour Party then, that was slightly different. So they have a more focus on local nominations. So different parts of a local party branch could nominate a candidate to be put forward for the local seat. So something like a women's committee, or maybe the ward membership of a local constituency Labour Party, or maybe a local union. They could nominate a candidate, and how the number of nominations you get impacts on whether you get onto the final shortlist or not. And then say the local association would put together their own shortlist. I think they also have a national list as well that they could use to create that shortlist. And then again, it's the local party who decide who is going on the ballot paper. And again, this changes later as well, especially in the 1990s when the Labour Party bring in things like all-women shortlists. And the Lib Dems, they have a sort of traditionally much more open and much more local recruitment process, but it's really dependent on the seat itself. So if there's a Liberal Democrat seat that they think they're going to win, or maybe a very big national by-election or something, then the National Party is going to be very much more involved in the selection. And this isn't even talking about the periods when it was much more complicated before the Liberal Democrat Party was even formed. And the Liberals were in alliance with the SDP, and they had lots of negotiations about how the selection was handled in each constituency.
So the candidates are going to be getting seriously grilled by the local party members, maybe more so if it's a safe seat for that party, because they're almost certainly likely to become the member of parliament for that constituency. So they're going to need someone who really knows their stuff, who can answer these questions in selection. So selection is a really important part of politics, of the political career. So you've got to have the right credentials, you've got to tick the right boxes, and you've got to really, really know your stuff.
Yeah, I think so. And the idea of credentials really comes across in our first clip, which is from Michael Heseltine, very well-known figure in the Conservative Party. And he was interviewed for our project by Mike Greenwood back in 2012. He sat in the Commons from 1966 to 2001, and he represented the constituencies of Tavistock and Henley. Now, he spent many years in the cabinet. He challenged Thatcher for the leadership, and then he lost out to John Major in the 90s, and he eventually became Deputy Prime Minister, never quite made it to Prime Minister. Here he is talking about his first selection process.
I was being interviewed by people who'd never seen me before. And so you're a fresh face. You put your best foot forward, and you try to persuade them that you'll be a good representative. I suppose that I had many of the credentials classically associated with Conservative candidate. I had a very attractive wife. I had a family. I was self-employed, so to speak, and quite fluent, and had a background that sounded, acceptable. So that was one's experience, and I did well against that.
So there you are, Alex. Those are the credentials. Are you going to be a Tory MP?
I don't know. I think I fit some of them. I like the idea of being fluent. But it's certainly a really interesting list, isn't it? I'm really struck by the notion of that he talks about of having an attractive wife, of that being so important, and so important that's something that he mentions. And this is something that we hear a lot in interviews, isn't it? I mean, I remember my interview with Geoffrey Lawler, and he talks about how his wife was really put under the microscope and really examined. And he talks about in that interview about how his wife had too short a miniskirt on, and how this was very much frowned upon, and how the selection, when she sat on the stage with him, the selection committee were a little bit unsure about him as an American, and that this sort of marked him down in some ways. So it's interesting that the whole family, in a way, or certainly the partner or spouse, is certainly being under scrutiny as much as the potential MP. Yeah, it's interesting that a wife could be an extra asset to a local party. I mean, I don't know. Do you find that?
I think we hear that a lot, especially this idea that the wife is going to be working in the constituency as well, and is going to be represented in the constituency as well. But that really takes it back to an ideal MP. If you needed an ideal wife, then you needed to be a man. So there's quite a lot that comes out for women that they were asked about their wife's name on papers to apply for seats. Janet Fuchs told me that one advertisement she saw is right at the top of the advert: no bachelors, no women. So that was the end of that one. And the same in the Labour Party. At my interview with Hilary Armstrong, she talked a lot about the working men's club culture and how women weren't really seen as being sort of, politics wasn't what they did, and they weren't being seen as the sort of right type to stand. And she spoke a lot about having to be 3 or 4 times better. And we get this a lot from women's selection, that they have to be 3 or 4 times better to be considered to be good enough to compete with men in the sort of the 1990s.
So in the 80s and before, being a man with a beautiful wife was clearly an asset. And we'll be talking more about the experience of women in later episodes, won't we? So everyone should watch out for that. But just going back to the notion of the ideal MP and having a wife as an extension of the image, there are quite a lot of quotes from our interviews about parties being wary of single men as candidates, aren't there? I mean, there's Hugo Summerson's interview where he was told to bring a female friend to meet at the selection committee to act as his girlfriend.
Yeah, we have quite a few of that. That's very clear that some parties were very wary of bachelors, both in the Conservative and the Labour parties, because they didn't want to risk selecting a gay man. And quite often this is just straight up homophobia. They don't want a gay man. And I say Hugo Summerson talks about bringing along a friend. Chris Pond, the Labour Party MP, talks about that he actually had to write to the executive of the Labour Party saying that he was a great friend of the gay community, but he wasn't a member of the gay community because it was impacting on where he was getting selected. David Howell, another Conservative, who talks about being under great suspicion because he wasn't married, and that was not seen so well by the local parties when he was going for seats.
So it's starting to become sort of a tricky process, isn't it? Getting selected if you're not the right type. And of course, this is straight up sexism and homophobia. So there's this idea that there is the ideal MP, and the candidate has to tick those boxes of what they think the local party wants, and not just the constituency or the wider country, what the local party wants. And we have lots of examples of people being worried that they don't fit into this. So in the next clip, we have this exact problem being talked about by Timothy Kirkhope and how he felt during the selection process. Kirkhope was elected in 1987 as the MP for Leeds North East after losing 2 elections in constituencies that voted traditionally for Labour. He sat in Parliament until 1997 when he lost his seat. In 1999, he was elected to the European Parliament, and in 2016, David Cameron named Kirkhope as a nominee for a life peerage. He sits now in the House of Lords as Baron Kirkhope of Harrogate, and he was interviewed by Henry Irving in 2014. So in this clip, he's discussing getting onto the national candidates list as a Conservative member, but we have a similar quotation about individual constituency party interviews.
And there was undoubtedly a massive amount of prejudice against people from the northeast of England. People in London who made these decisions had a snooty view Someone from the northeast, yes, they could fight a northeast seat, but not anywhere else in the country. I thought that was appalling, but that's the way it was. The party was like that, and the vice chairman almost inevitably were rather sort of pompous people, mostly from sort of backgrounds of the Guards and the clubs of London sort of thing. One saying to me that first question when I went for an interview, which clubs are you a member of? And so I think I'd said something like I was a member of the North Northumberland Cricket Club or something. And he said that wasn't quite what he meant. And something about, I was saying something to him about, I don't know, horses or something. He said, oh, I play polo. He says, do you play polo? I mean, polo to me was a mint. I know that may sound a little bit chip on the shoulder from me, but that's what it was like. And also the question started, things like, which school did you go to, you see? So I was very proud to be able to say RGS Newcastle. And they said, oh, yes, provincial grammar. Oh, yes, tick, tick. That was the attitude. And you didn't have any kind of fairness about this. There was no sort of objectivity. It was just if they liked you or they didn't. So I think that held me back a bit. So I wasn't allowed really at that stage to go out of my region to fight a seat.
I think this is such a great clip from Kirkhope reflecting on this idea of what an ideal Conservative MP should be. And there's so much about his background, what school he went to, whether he had the right accent. And we get quite a lot from MPs in the North, and whether they played the right sports and so on. And all these sort of assumptions at local level really influence the type of people we get to be MPs at this period. And it sort of explains why they all look like a certain type of white middle class man before the 1990s. We'll get onto this a bit more in another episode when we talk about underrepresented MPs. But yeah, this idea, this is who they are, and the fact that he felt like it held him back as a Conservative. There weren't that many seats in the North East that he was likely to win.
No, and he ended up representing Harrogate, didn't he? Which was allowed to stand for that one. But it's an incredible clip, isn't it? I sense a certain type of bitterness in there. He talks about how the interviewing panel was snooty towards him, and it's interesting that he would maintain this sort of allegiance to the Conservative Party, despite them holding certain views and prejudices that he clearly felt about him.
Mm-hmm. It's funny, isn't it? Because he also doesn't sound like he's from a particularly working class background to me. He certainly sounds like he has the right accent and the thing to tick these boxes, but clearly not quite what they were looking for when they were interviewing him.
No. But I suppose, to be fair, despite not ticking that interviewer's boxes, he did eventually have a very successful political career. These attitudes and judgments about candidates seems to be something that comes up a lot in Conservative interviews, don't they? It's something that sort of representation and being the right person is something that is very strongly focused on in the interviews with Conservative MPs.
I think so, yeah. I think we do get that in the Labour Party as well. There are sort of stereotypical ideas of who could be a good Labour MP, and they might be slightly different. So we've got someone like Chris Price, who talks about his Labour colleagues considering him too posh, and then his sister, who also became an MP, was sort of worried about standing for a Labour Party candidate when she didn't really consider herself working class. So there is this sort of idea of the same sort of thing in the Labour Party.
Yeah, as you say, there is that idea of the stereotypical Labour MP, isn't there, from a working class background, strong union experience, often with families, generally fathers in the union, that really develop their political consciousness. So yeah, there is that strong line in the Labour Party as well, isn't there? But it's something that we do see quite strongly in the interviews with Conservative MPs. Yes,
and we've got this wonderful clip from a Labour MP, Brian McGee, and I think we're going to hear that one in episode 5. But basically, he gets told when he gets into Parliament that all the Labour MPs are either the Freds or the Tonys. So they're either the working class union member Freds, or they're the very upper class intellectual left-wingers, the Tonys. So these very strong stereotypes of the type of people who would be Labour Party candidates as well as Conservative.
And where their allegiances might be, and where their politics.
Yes, definitely.
Their politics would be.
Yeah, and I guess if you looked like the right type, or perhaps if you knew the right type of people, it would make your selection process much easier. So this next clip is from the former Lincoln MP, Dick Taverne, who was interviewed by Jason Lower back in 2012. So Dick Taverne, who's now Lord Taverne, was a Labour MP from 62 to 72. He was a minister under Harold Wilson, but then he was deselected in 72 by his local constituency party over his views on Europe. So the constituency party remains very powerful even after he finally got onto that ballot paper. And then he ended up sitting for the SDP and now sits in the Lords as a Lib Dem. So here he is talking about how he was first selected.
I was walking Fleet Street one day when my friend Bill Rogers, who was General Secretary of the Favouring Society, said, "Hello, Dick, are you interested in standing for Parliament?" And I said, "Why do you ask?" And he said, "Well, there's an interesting constituency, Putney, where an election is being, they're adopting their candidate. One of the wards decided to have a brains trust of 4 candidates. One of them's dropped out, and I was asked, could I find somebody else? So I thought of you." And I said, "Okay, that sounds quite interesting. I'll go along." The brains trust was the next day. And I managed to get nominated by that ward. And to my enormous surprise, I suddenly became the candidate for Lincoln in the 1950, no, not Lincoln, sorry, Putney in the 1959 election.
So he got Lincoln mistaken for Putney.
Yes, I think this is the first time he was standing for candidacy for Parliament, but he ended up eventually sitting for Lincoln. And when you do a lot of these things, Alex, it's all very difficult and confusing to keep on track of it all.
Fair enough. I just thought, Putney's a very long way from Lincoln. But regardless of that slip, it's a really interesting response, isn't it, to the questioning about candidacy and the way that he meets someone on Fleet Street, doesn't he? And that the idea is that the seed is sown in Fleet Street. It's I suppose it suggests, to some extent, it's not what you know, it's who you know.
Mm-hmm. I think we have a lot about this in all the different parties, that it's very, very helpful if you know the right people. So someone like David Owen, who went on to be Foreign Secretary, his first nomination, he got that because his local party knew his father. And so they knew his father. His father was a local doctor. And so he sort of did better. He beat Betty Boothroyd to win that seat, partly because of his local connections. And we've got loads of other examples of this.
It's a good thing to have influential parents as well, isn't it? I suppose. Yeah. I mean, Hilary Armstrong, who was Labour MP, wasn't she, was selected and elected to her father's Northwest Durham seat on his retirement. Mm-hmm. She was adamant that it went out of her way to emphasise her independence from her
I
dad.
think she was quite embarrassed that she took over her father's old seat, because she'd been fighting so much to get selected in loads of different seats, that the fact that she felt it undermined her a bit, that it was her father's old seat she got. And it was my interview with her, and I remember her being very fierce, like, no, I won that fair and square. She was very, very adamant about it, and a bit embarrassed, I think, about that sort of nepotism perhaps coming through.
Fair enough. And I suppose the constituency party would perhaps see her as a known quantity as
Exactly.
well, maybe. I don't know, but certainly went on to have a stellar political career. Mm-hmm. But getting selected as an MP was really difficult then, as we've seen. And it's personal, isn't it? Politics is a personal business, either what you know or who you know or how you represent yourself, how you're seen. So if you know the right people, you knew the internal politics of the local party, then you had a much greater chance and opportunity of getting selected.
Mm-hmm. And in lots of these examples, lots of these seats are sort of for the no-hoper seats. They're the first rung on the ladder for people. So the Dick Taverne seat, he probably wasn't going to win Putney for the Labour Party, but it's very much that first bit of experience to get him started off on his political career.
That's it. Lots of the MPs we interview do talk about that, don't they? As I get selected for this seat where I've got absolutely no chance, but I learn the ropes, I learn the processes. Then I go on to hopefully to better things once I've proven my mettle.
Yes, we have the Conservative MP James Couchman saying, you go away, you build your CV. And that's that comes across in quite a lot of the interviews.
Yeah, that's a wonderful phrase, isn't it? Building your CV, showing what you can do and how, knowing that you're committed to the cause as well in a way, and you're willing to go for these sort of forlorn hopes before something better.
Mm-hmm. Or you're going to put your time on a local council, or sit as a local councillor, or be involved in the party a lot to sort of make yourself known. So the generation that we're quite often talking to, so the ones who are being selected before the 90s, it's not really common to be parachuted into a safe seat after being a special advisor in Westminster. That's a much more modern phenomenon. And a lot of the MPs we speak to are very contemptuous about the MPs who they see as being parachuted straight in.
Yeah, and who haven't got experience of life beyond Westminster, beyond Parliament, beyond being spads. I remember interviewing several MPs actually who were quite critical of people like David Cameron for that, having that kind of background. Following on from this, we now have a clip, don't we, from the Conservative MP, Cabinet Minister and Chairman of the party, Kenneth Baker, who sat in the Commons from 1968 to 1997 and is now in the House of Lords. We've got a lot of Lords in this.
We have a lot of Lords in this one.
Upset anybody. Anyway, Kenneth Baker was interviewed in 2012 by Mike Greenwood, and here he is.
I got myself put on the candidates list for the Conservative Party, and I was now clearly a Conservative. And I put myself forward for Poplar. The East End seat was a clear Labour seat, because in those days, if you want to put a career, you start in the Labour seat, you go to a marginal seat, then you go to a safe seat. You don't do what Cameron and Osborne have done, parachuted straight into safe seats. You worked your passage. And I worked by being a councillor, first of all. And I went and worked, and so I stood for Poplar in 1964 election.
Oh, perfect. There you go. Criticism of David Cameron there and Osborne.
Yes, I say he's not alone in this in the archive, is he? And the sort of idea, a modern criticism of like career politicians and the MPs look all the same. But clearly there's a huge amount of career planning in this process, or way back in the 60s and 70s. It's definitely not a new thing to be ambitious and want to be an MP, and how you work yourself through it. I mean, we've got a great bit in the Anne Widdecombe interview that we talked about in episode 1, and she talks a lot about how she did her degree and then went back to Oxford just so she could make her name in the Oxford Union, and then talks a lot about, then I went and joined my local association. I got involved in a local association. I sort of held offices in it. I was a councillor, and then I got a no hoper seat, and then I got a marginal seat, and then I got my safe seat, and I was in Parliament. And she says the whole process took about 15 years, but to have the commitment to go back and do a second degree because you knew you wanted to be in politics is a pretty clear career politician to me, I would think.
Yeah. And you mentioned the Oxford Union. Could you say a little bit more about that? That's the debating union,
yes.
Isn't it?
Yes, the Oxford Debating Union, and there's sort of lots of former presidents of the Oxford Debating Union who end up as prime ministers and cabinet members and so on. But it's certainly seen as somewhere where you can make your name, you can make a lot of good contacts, and you sort of get yourself known before that in that early part of your life, and then it helps in the selection process if you can say you've been the president of the Oxford Union.
And of course, if you've gone to the Oxford Union, you're president of the Oxford Union, you're clearly good at speaking, good at oratory, and that's going to put you in good stead both at selection and on the floor of the chamber.
Yeah, a very old-fashioned training ground, but
a fairly common one for a lot of the interviews we've conducted. I loved Kenneth Baker's conversation and mentioning of working your passage. I think that's a great phrase. Very like building your CV, working your passage. Go for those difficult seats and work your way through. And of course, the Labour Party had another career route, didn't they, at this time? And a lot of Labour MPs are equally as focused. And the one way that they come through to party politics is through the unions, and in certain seats the unions controlled selections entirely, so their links and funding of local parties was really important, and being a member of the union obviously would help you in that.
Definitely. And it is also another way of training ground. You're building more connections with people. You're learning how to manage meetings and to speak for someone and to argue. And it's a different type of oratory, perhaps, to go and negotiate with your bosses for the case of your workers, but you're still learning politics, aren't you? And say with the fact that the trade unions control a lot of seats in the Labour Party, or they did control a lot of seats, they fund certain seats. So we have Tom Cox, who was a Labour Party member, talking to us about how he got on the union parliamentary panel, and so he was given sort of access to seats that the unions controlled. Ended up being selected for one of these seats because of his strong union links. So it is another way in the Labour Party that they could do it.
Get through. We have Joe Ashton, don't we, the Labour MP from 68 to 2001, complaining in one of our interviews that he didn't get selected because all the seats were allocated because the unions bought all the seats in Parliament. So through their funding and paying for it, so they're a powerful force in Labour politics, and to be part of that is a nice way in.
Yeah,
I suppose
definitely. I'm not sure they're as powerful now as they used to be, but yes, it definitely is a good route in for lots of our interviewees. Yeah, so we hear a lot in our interviews about the sort of relationship between the National Party and the local party, and this gets to be really, really crucial when, in the same way that the unions controlled certain seats, if a seat is seen to be a safe seat and therefore an almost guaranteed route into Westminster, then the National Party are going to have a lot more involvement often in that selection process. I think this is still really coming up today a lot, and a lot more interest in the current run up to the general election, that there's sort of a lot more interest in who's getting selected in these safe seats. And this really comes up in this next clip, which is from the Scottish Conservative MP Teddy Taylor, who was interviewed by James Freeman in 2012. And in this case, he's not talking about being selected for a safe seat, but his sort of first opportunity to stand for Parliament in Glasgow Springburn back in 1959. Teddy Taylor became very famous as a very committed Eurosceptic, and this kept him a lot on the back benches, and he was well known for rebelling time and time again against the European Union. In this first clip, he gets selected, but he's not on the candidates list, and the fallout from this becomes a bit tricky for him.
What happened was that they said they wanted me, and I said I'd be quite glad to do it. Then the party phoned up and said, me, so you're not on the candidates list, you can't do it. And so virtually after a battle, because the person who was their chairman was a real tough guy and shouted at them and said, and you've got to have him as our candidate, whether you like it or not, the kind of thing. So you can't do that. And so eventually they had to ask me to go through for a special meeting in Edinburgh. They said, don't worry, you'll be approved, But I had to go and meet someone who was the chairman of the party. And I said, I don't fancy doing that at all. But eventually the chairman of our local party said, you're not going to Edinburgh. We're in charge, not these bloody Tories, the kind of thing. And so it was very embarrassing. So eventually we came to a compromise that I would have a meeting in Glasgow with one of their people. So they sent through an officials from Edinburgh to Glasgow, and they interviewed me and then decided I was an appropriate candidate. And so I went back to my friends in Springburn and said, well, I'm glad to say that I've been approved. And so when they said, look, they didn't approve you, we approved you, the kind of thing.
So that's great, isn't it? Stuck between a rock and a hard place in a way, but I think he navigates it very tactfully. I think that's part of what he's showing us, isn't it?
It's an interesting idea of a compromise, isn't it, where you get exactly what you want and they come to you to approve you rather than you doing anything at all for
exactly.
it.
Yeah. Who had the authority to approve him is and they're clearly at loggerheads and fighting over that, aren't they? Even though the outcome is going to be the same in a way. But it shows that the power of local officials in that instance, and that's the case through a lot of our interviews, isn't it? That the local constituency party, this is their chance to shine, this is their chance to show their power. And if it's not respected, then they'll be very upset and hurt. And you do need them going forward for the election, don't you? You need them to help you fight for that seat.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think this is the bit of power that they've definitely got control of, and they're very, very jealously guard it. And I mean, Teddy Taylor isn't the only one in our archive who wasn't officially approved before standing. Elizabeth Peacock's got a great clip where she talks about a friend of hers just sending her all the advertisements for the selection things, even though she's been specifically not approved to go on the candidates list, and ends up getting selected, and then they have to argue about it afterwards about whether she's allowed to stand or not. So
that's for Batley and Spen, isn't it? That's when she became MP.
Yes, and she won. So the local party knew what they were doing in that case. She was able to be. Well, that's it.
Yeah,
won.
I mean, in a way, does the local party know more about the needs of the local constituency? I mean, maybe so. So I suppose it's an example, I suppose, of democracy in action, perhaps.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's just which type of seat you end up getting. So the Batley and Spen was a marginal seat that Elizabeth Peacock was able to hold on for quite some time. She knew the area, she knew it was changing and things like that. But isn't just a matter of whether you're going to have an easy election or not. It can impact an MP's entire career, whether they're in a safe seat or in a marginal one where they're constantly doing an awful lot of casework, where they're having to have their name in the local paper every week, where they're really having to have themselves known in the local constituency if they're fighting for every single vote. Yeah,
and in a safe seat, potentially they're more open to promotions up into cabinet. They maybe don't have to keep such a close eye on the local constituency business in the same way that someone in a marginal seat sort of has to, don't they? So yeah, which seat you get selected for is crucial, isn't it? And selection process as a result is so important. The next clip is from Labour MP Michael Barnes, who was interviewed by Philip Aylett in 2013. Michael Barnes represented a marginal constituency of Brentford and Chiswick from 1966 to February 1974. He became a founding member of the SDP before returning to the Labour Party some 2 years later.
As an MP for a very marginal constituency, you obviously had to give a high priority to your constituents' work. And I tried to make my dealing with correspondence, a real priority. I mean, I was slightly horrified that there were printed cards in the House of Commons for MPs, presumably with large majorities to use, which said, thank you very much for your letter dated so-and-so. I have taken it up with the minister, the point you raised with the minister, and I will be in touch in due course. And MPs, literally, some MPs just signed these things. But, I mean, when I wrote to a minister, I didn't just act as a postbox. I really tried to act as an advocate, for somebody's problem. And there's no doubt that paid off in the 1970 election when I was re-elected against the swing, because I'd been able in the 4 intervening years to build up something of a reputation as a good constituency MP. So that took a lot of time.
Yeah, so I think that's such an interesting clip, and that one of the horror stories that people think about MPs, that they're not actually reading their post and they're just signing printed things, and very few of ours ever admit to doing anything like that. We have much more of this similar sort of story where they're very involved in their constituency work. So the Conservative MP John Hannam, who was elected for Exeter between 70 and 97, would complain about the people in safe seats who would just go through the motions, but for him, like, his constituents' work was already number one, his absolute priority. And I think a lot of them are really proud of it. You must have spoken to people who have been proud of being a constituency MP and feeling like that's where they can really make a difference. Definitely,
yeah. Particularly for the backbenchers who are sort of steadfastly on the backbenches, they often find that working for the constituency is their duty and something they really relish. They really enjoy visiting and meeting people in the local constituency. Mm-hmm. But there are others who are perhaps more ambitious and find constituency work very annoying. I remember interviewing James Ramsden, and I remember asking him what was one of the frustrations of being in Parliament, and I think he said something like, "Go into the constituency," which I thought was very honest. Well, very amusing.
James Ramsden was an MP in the 60s, was he? Was it even earlier than that? Or I think remember.
He was, in the 60s and earlier. Yeah. He was the last Secretary of State for War. He liked going out on fox hunts around Harrogate, but I'm not sure if he enjoyed going to visit his constituency and dealing with constituents. But I think, Michael Barnes talks about these generic letters. I think I've received something like a generic letter like that from when I once wrote to an MP a long time ago.
That to be a generic email now rather than a printed piece of that. But yeah. No, but it's strange, isn't it? We get the real differences between, we've got the Rosie Barnes, who was an SDB MP, who said she was being criticised for being like a social worker for doing so much work, or Jackie Ballard, who said that she felt she made a real difference in the constituency, compared to someone maybe a bit more like your Michael Heseltines, or someone who definitely want to be there to make a name for themselves and to be in cabinet and to make to progress in national politics. And so the constituency is much less important to them.
Yeah, I mean, in one of our recordings, Michael Heseltine pretty much says that, doesn't he? He says something like, I had a big majority. They could say he's not there, but they knew where I was. So I think that in that sophisticated home county seat, there was an acceptance that if you have ambitious guys, you can't expect them to be doing the job of a local councillor.
Yeah.
And sums it up.
Then say John Eden saying, my job was represent my constituents in Parliament, not to be a bottle washer in the constituency. And Chris Pond saying, on the other hand, wanted to be a minister, but if he wasn't here in the constituency, then he wasn't going to get back in. So it works both ways, I guess.
And Chris Pond was a Labour MP, wasn't he? So it's both sides of the House of Commons, I think it's fair to say.
And I guess it could be a pressure in another way for a marginal seat. We've got this brilliant interview with Helen Hayman, who had a baby in Parliament in the 1970s, and I think we'll talk more about her experience in a later episode. But when she was there in the 1970s, the Labour Party had such a small majority. If she stood down as she wanted to, then the government would have fallen. So she felt completely trapped by being in a marginal constituency and being in that position that she couldn't give up her seat. And so she's trying to have a baby and do all these other things whilst desperately trying to keep on being an MP. It's not an easy situation.
Exactly. And if you lose your seat, you lose your job, don't you? So it's very difficult.
Mm-hmm. And I think, there's a lot of reflections throughout these interviews that show us sort of the different roles that MPs have and how so much of their careers or their choices are really being influenced by the type of seat, the type of constituency that they end up representing.
So, of course, internal party politics could be very complicated, and MPs could face no confident votes. And something we haven't mentioned, they could even be deselected, can't they, for rebelling against the party, presenting internal opposition. But we will discuss this in our next episode, so don't fear, where we'll be talking about the whipping system. So we'll look at the tensions between local and national politics, and what do you do as an MP if you're asked to vote for something for the party, but which your constituency would not approve at all. So yeah, look out for that.
Yep, see you next time. Thank you for listening to Tales from the Green Benches from the History of Parliament. If you enjoyed this episode, please do leave us a review, follow and share with all of your friends. You can follow the History of Parliament on social media @HisParl.
These podcasts are written by ourselves and Priscilla Pivato. We want to thank our brilliant team at the History of Parliament, including all our wonderful volunteers and all the former MPs who gave up their time to be interviewed. You can find our archive at the British Library and references to all the clips we played today in the show notes.
To find out more about us, check out the History of Parliament's website, thehistoryofparliamentonline.org, or read our book, The Political Lives of Post-War British MPs, by myself and Priscilla Pivato.